Hi everyone, I'm Airier, and we're going to look at Overly Sarcastic Productions' next episode. This is going to be Quetzalcoatl. Now, I actually know a bit about this from FGO, so I'm assuming, in this case, I don't think this is a big sister complex deity with a fascination with Lucha Libre. On the other hand, I could be wrong, because FGO has been right so many times that even though that is completely ridiculous and absurd, and I'm pretty sure Lucha Libre existed much later than this myth started, in a completely different culture, maybe there's something to it. Because FGO has done that. Yeah. I keep coming back to that one, that it's often more right than I gave it credit for, and it's disturbing. So we're going to jump right in and see what happened. Otherwise, you guys know the deal. Link below, video, hit it up. It's Overly Sarcastic Productions. You know it's good. Do that. Let's get started.
Hey, here's a fun thing people seem to forget. Ancient cultures were cultures, as in they changed. See, looking back on them, it's easy to see ancient cultures as these static, creed-based civilizations where everyone lived the same way for hundreds of years and worshipped a multi-theistic pantheon that never underwent any significant...
Oh, so if we're talking about immediately the cultures change, Quetzalcoatl probably went through shifts. So I know them as the big good, but that's mostly influenced by FGO. So were they eventually going through phases of people liking and hating them? Ooh, sorry, I like it when things change and there's just really weird interpretations.
changes, and then when the civilization fell apart, everyone in the civilization presumably evaporated or spontaneously mummified themselves. So obviously all Romans wore togas.
I mean, didn't a lot of Romans wear togas? I thought that was pretty common.
All Norsemen were seafaring Vikings, and ancient Japan was all katanas and kimonos, which by the...
Okay, I have no idea what movie this is from, but just look at that kitty. Oh my god, it's a kitty. I'm sorry, we're getting Cat Slayer today, and I am very distracted by that. Also, kitty. It's like super intense. Sword ready. Great lighting. And cat. It's just the dichotomy is absolutely hilarious.
Which, by the way, would be a good name for a feudal Japan role-playing game. But obviously, that's super not true. Just like America's gone from being a universally Christian and European nation to a multicultural melting pot in less than 300 years, ancient civilizations underwent religious and cultural changes all the time. Like, for a big example, ancient Greek worship of the Hellenistic pantheon, which is almost the quintessential ancient pantheon and ancient civilization combo, wasn't ever one consistent thing. Sure, there was a broad-scale state religion, but it...
Wait, it wasn't? Oh. Okay, this actually just became way more fascinating to me, not just in the Quetzalcoatl sense, but in the actual sense of I don't know how things change. Because I know she talked previously about how Amun-Ra and Ra were interchangeable, and he wasn't always the main one because other things. Also things I watch on Simon Whistler's channel about just the worship in general and Alexandria and just all that crazy stuff. This, though, I wasn't aware that their pantheon varied that much. I realized the stories changed a lot, but I thought they kind of stuck to the basic interpretation. Which is why she's bringing up that it changed, because I'm literally the person she's talking about, not realizing it. Yeah.
It was supplemented by dozens, if not hundreds, of localized cults that honored specific deities, and whatever cults were more prominent at any given time also determined what gods were more prominent in worship overall. Stuff was constantly in flux, and as a result, most myths have at least a handful of variant tellings as a result of localization and disparate cult interpretations. There's basically no canon as a result of this natural drift, and in a more dramatic version than Choose Your Own Adventure myths, sometimes you had total theistic overhauls as a result of key events in a culture's history. So
wait, total overhaul? Oh, so it wasn't just like, here's a different interpretation. It's flat out, we're going to... They literally retcon their own religion. Oh. Oh, that's way more dramatic than I was expecting.
Today we'll be talking about the quintessential Mesoamerican god, the one basically everyone has at least heard about, and even better, the one that had his own Indiana Jones-style cult and a dinosaur named after him. Let's talk Quetzalcoatl. But as we've just discussed, cultures change, and Quetzalcoatl is an old god, even by Mesoamerican standards. He doesn't have any broad-scale consistent myths or stories, or at least none that we know about anymore. So before I get into the details of how the cult of the feathered serpent became culturally ubiquitous in Mesoamerica, it's time for a history lesson. So the feathered serpent's story begins way back in the lost and found city of Teotihuacan. Quetzalcoatl only gets caught if the serpent's story begins.
I keep doing that thing where if I hold down the click, it keeps speeding up. Also, the pyramid structures they built are so freaking cool. There's actually a bunch in St. Louis, which is weird when you think about it because, you know, ancient pyramid structures in St. Louis are not what you expect, but that is a thing that happened. And they're still there. So, yeah, you could actually visit them. Highway goes right to it. It's actually kind of fascinating. I would really like to go visit it someday. But then I think this was one down in Mexico or somewhere in Central America. Oh, there's so many cool things.
way back in the lost and found city of Teotihuacan, but Quetzalcoatl only gets codified when the Aztec Empire forms almost 1700 years after that. So let's start there, because it's a starting point that most of us have at least a little bit of understanding of. In my Huitzilopochtli video, I talked about Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, which was sacred.
Those are all words, and I think I missed all of them. I might be... Because it wasn't probably a miscellaneous miss, was probably something else categorized under, so I haven't seen that one yet, and which means I need to go back and watch that eventually. Also, those are a lot of names that I am not going to pronounce correctly.
To the sun god Huitzilopochtli, and in Huitzilopochtli's origin story, we touched on the birth of Quetzalcoatl.
Oh, no, wait, never mind. I did see this one. It's just the name is so incomprehensible, I can't say it. But this is the one where the myths itself around the Aztec was coming forward, and it was about how it was literally the night and the sun fighting, and it was a battle to the death all the time against the night. Okay, I remember that part, yeah.
Happy fun deity of arts and crafts who also happened to be an enormous fuck you dragon. What was interesting about that myth is that it doesn't actually explain anything about Quetzalcoatl. Certainly not to the same...
Wait, who is this guy? Dragon. Important? Question mark. Irrelevant to myth, so why was he named? Is he a dragon? I mean, in the Eastern sense, sure, and in the general sense prior to it becoming very standardized in Europe, yeah, it counts as a dragon. Serpent that flies, more or less, and even the flying thing was kind of added on later.
Level of detail that it explains Huitzilopochtli and Coyolxauhqui. He's just kind of not there 1 minute and there the next, and then they move on. So clearly, Quetzalcoatl was already a major player in the Aztec belief system even before this myth got codified, or he would have warranted a more detailed explanation for why we should care. So where did he come from? Well, the Aztec civilization only really got big in the 14th century, but the people who would become part of the Aztec...
Oh, so this is actually mostly in the... I mean, I know it was mostly here, but for some reason I thought it was in Central America, not technically North America. I know, American bias to think that Mexico is technically Central America. It's just where my head is. I know it's wrong. For some reason, my head just goes there. Also, technically, they also have part of California. Yeah. Borders are weird.
Who at this point in history were the Nahua, specifically the Mexica, started migrating into central Mexico as early as the 6th century. They founded Tenochtitlan in the 1300s and started putting together their empire. Now, Huitzilopochtli wasn't that much of a big shot deity.
Whoa. So it's just a guy who looks like he has flayed skin with a bird head around his and a giant headdress. That is metal and terrifying. Also, nice beard.
At this point. He'd been relatively small potatoes in the Nahua religion, but after the Aztec Empire was formed in an alliance between 3 major tribes, this guy Tlacaelel, who had organized the Triple Alliance in the first place, decided to pull an Akhenaten and totally revamp the Nahuatl religion, elevating the former nobody god Huitzilopochtli up to full-scale solar deity and city patron. That's how we got the fun and the sun god we all know and love, and also how we got such a clear-cut origin story for him. It was a government-mandated myth, and frankly, the Aztecs didn't last long enough for it to drift. So...
Wait, they didn't? I don't actually know how long the Aztec culture was around for, now I think about it. Because my perspective has always been, it's ancient and huge and made grand structures, but I don't know how many centuries, decades, millennia they were around. You know, considering it's not something that's exactly unknown knowledge, I probably should have figured that out by now. On the other hand, I do not ever understand numbers, and they just go right over my head. So they probably knew and just immediately forgot out of sheer whoa effect. Yeah, it's a little awkward doing that uncontrollably sometimes, but if you show me numbers, I will do that. It is a problem I'm trying to work on, and I'm failing horribly.
If the Aztec/Nahuatl religion underwent such a total overhaul in the early 1400s, what was it like before? And does this maybe explain where Quetzalcoatl actually came from?
So
well, remember how I brought up Teotihuacan a couple paragraphs ago? Let's go way back, 1700 years before the Aztecs, to 300 BCE, 900 years before the Nahua people entered the scene, and back when nomadic tribes were first starting to form settlements in Mesoamerica. In 200 BCE, somebody, and we still don't know who, starts building Teotihuacan. Within 300 years, by 100 AD,
so this entire structure was actually a starting point for what came up?
The Pyramid of the Sun, the most impressive building in Teotihuacan, has been completed. By 450 AD, the civilization in Teotihuacan...
Oh, this is an interpretation of what it looked like? So you have the main structures that were physical monuments, and then all the actual buildings that might have collapsed over years. Probably left ruins behind, though. Interesting the use of courtyards. Unless that's entirely artistic interpretation. Either way, though, it looks really cool.
Is at the height of its power and influence. References to their people are found all over Mesoamerica, and evidence of their architectural and art style are similarly common. It's an industrial center and produces all kinds of art, incredible paintings and murals, as well as obsidian tools. The population is estimated to be 125,000 people at least, which would make it the...
125,000? That many millennia ago? Whoa. Just a reminder that Columbus introducing diseases did considerably kill a lot of people. And then the Spanish, and then the Spanish again, and then the Spanish again, and I'm sure a bunch of other people, and probably the Spanish again.
Sixth largest city in the world at this point in history. Teotihuacan.
Sixth? What were the first 5? You know, the more I get into myths, the more I'm like, oh, there's also history attached that I had no idea about. I actually think I'm something of a history buff because I just get fascinated by this, but it's actually kind of amazing right now to find out there's so much more I don't know. It's the weirdest thing ever. Like, some people are like, there's so much I can't learn it all. I'm just like, more cool shit. It's like walking into a candy store and knowing that you have just enough money to buy anything, but not enough time to eat it all. But you can just try as much as you want. Just, Sorry, I'm geeking out right now. I'm aware of that. But I'm fine with that also.
Teotihuacan is functionally an empire a full 1,000 years before the Aztecs are a thing. And side note,
really?
The city layout of Teotihuacan is incredibly beautiful. They had a grid. Then around the 6th century,
they actually... So that wasn't just artistic interpretation. They actually gridded it out. Ooh. Hey, what's down there? Vague Mexica population.
population of Teotihuacan starts declining. Around the 7th century, the buildings housing the rulers of Teotihuacan are burned to the ground, and several statues are shattered with their pieces being deliberately scattered. Shortly thereafter, the city is completely abandoned, and just like that, a great civilization is gone. And no, we don't know why. That's what makes this fun. The current theory...
Honestly, which one of you idiots broke the river? Way to go, Paul. Oh, a river broke, so they probably did something to it.
Is that there was some kind of internal unrest, maybe even a civil uprising, possibly fueled by some climate shifting induced droughts that we know occurred around 500 AD. But we still don't know for sure why the city was abandoned.
Because if you don't have a fresh water supply, large buildings without irrigation would probably need it. Unless they had irrigation, in which case... honestly, water supplies really do dictate where cities are even now, so it really doesn't change anything. Back then, they would have just so many fewer resources, so it makes sense that that would be a problem. I mean, if you want to see issues, just look at what happens with the Colorado River, man. That is going to show you all you need to know about how important water still is. So, yeah, that makes perfect sense if that's what actually happened. On the other hand, it could be a multitude of other things, so that's still fascinating. Sorry. I'm geeking out over history. I know we're here for the myths, but the history aspect is just absolutely fascinating.
Now, we know next to nothing about the civilization and gods of Teotihuacan on account of it being a lost civilization and all, but conveniently they left enough murals and statues to give us a rough idea of a few major players.
Ooh.
First off, continuing the tradition of Mesoamerican deities being f***ing terrifying, the patron goddess of Teotihuacan looked like this. And though we don't know any of their names, she's called alternately the Great Goddess of Teotihuacan or Teotihuacan Spider.
Whoa. And you can see that it looks like dropping blood and urine? Or bile. And it's literally feeding it to everything come up. I'm assuming blood because red, but bile or urine, I'm not sure which one's more disturbing.
Spider Woman. Yikes. Other players in the Teotihuacan pantheon.
That was a spider? I honestly would never have guessed that, except for the little spider hanging down right there. That's the only thing I would have guessed.
Of Teotihuacan or Teotihuacan Spider Woman. Yikes. Other players in the Teotihuacan pantheon included the Storm God, the Old God, the Netted Jaguar, the Polk God, the Fat God, the oh-so-charming
Wait, the Fat God?
The Storm God, the Old God, the Netted Jaguar, the Polk God, the Fat God, the...
Yeah, that, Oh, yeah, there's a stomach there. That's the Fat God. It even has nose hairs. Oh, my God. Bacchus equivalent, probably.
The oh-so...
This is Tepe-Totli, the Aztec flay god of springtime and agriculture, mostly because I couldn't find a representation of Teotihuacan. Oh, wow. There's a god of being flayed, agriculture, and springtime. That is a very disturbing myth. And mix, and everything about this is kind of terrifying.
The charming flayed god, and the feathered serpent. This, the feathered serpent on the side of the third largest pyramid in Teotihuacan, is the first recognizable reference to the god that would come to be known.
So, wait, that's actually the remains of it? Oh, dude, it actually survived that long? Oh, and they're all the little Greek, oh, not Greeks, like the embossments? I know there's a specific term for it, but I cannot remember off the top of my head. This is fascinating, dude. It looks like they probably had an underjaw that fell off from each of them. Same with down here. And so the feathered serpent was existing here so many centuries and millennia ago. And this is the first time they've actually seen it. Huh. but it was already prevalent enough then to be visible, so it had to exist in some form prior.
By the Aztecs is Quetzalcoatl, although it is worth noting that the earliest representation of feathered serpents, although not necessarily as a singular deity, date all the way back to the Olmecs in 900 BC. Now obviously, cultures swap gods all the time, the Romans being particularly egregious in this regard.
Yeah.
And while the flayed god also shows up later in a few places as a god of household chores. Household chores? The man has no skin!
I mean, one, ow. Two, that does represent how I feel when I have to do chores. Oh, hey, my skin's missing. Everything hurts. That's about the right feeling. Yeah, actually, that makes perfect sense.
The feathered serpent appears to be by far the biggest contribution that Teotihuacan effected on the greater Mesoamerican belief system. And unlike the Romans, who took totally separate gods and acted like they were the same under different names, in this case, the Mesoamerican feathered serpent really does seem to be all the same god, but known by different names in different tribes. The Nahuatl called him
Wait, in that case, would they have been starting from there or have already been everywhere and they all just interpreted? So that would imply cross-pollination of ideas. I know that happened in Europe between the eastern and western halves of the continents, or I guess the supercontinent, connecting Europe, Asia, and some of the Pacific nations. People on boats, man. That's how you get around. But I wasn't aware that was nearly as prevalent here so early on. Although it had to be, considering some of the initial thought process were crossing the land bridge from Siberia to or what became Alaska and then moving down throughout that range. So it would have probably worked that way, but I mean, even then, that's still just a theory.
Quetzalcoatl, while the Yucatec Mayans called him Kukulkan, and the Quiche Maya called him Cucumats. I'm definitely saying that wrong, I apologize.
And that's why in FGO, Quetzalcoatl was called Cuckoo. That actually makes sense. I thought that was just a stupid nickname, but it's actually a reference to the alternate names. Huh.
Pretty much every Mesoamerican tribe had a feathered serpent, some kind of interpretation of the original Teotihuacan god. And given that Teotihuacan had clearly been a trade hub, it kind of makes sense that some of their gods might have gone out along trade routes. Quetzalcoatl is
and it was a trade hub too. And that would be why they needed water and why it probably died, because a trade hub needs water, where it can get away with a lot of things, but if you don't drink, you die. You can buy a lot of things, but water doesn't transport well, and it's really hard. Like, literally, clay jars stopped up with, well, wax, resin, or more clay. It's really freaking heavy, man.
Functionally much, much older and more widely worshipped than any of the other Aztec deities, which you can actually kind of tell just by virtue of how little is said about him. Don't follow? See, old gods have a tendency to fade into cultural ubiquity because everybody worships them, everybody knows them, so why would they write about something everybody already knows?
Which actually makes sense, because even in the common parlance, when you have something that's so obvious, you don't talk about it. It's like, what is a Coca-Cola? Everyone out there is going like, what the fuck are you talking about? It's up. And then you just have to stop thinking. It's like, oh, wait, I know what that is. If you just have a red can and then you drink it, I don't even need to say Coke. You would have already realized exactly what I meant. It's such a common thing that you don't think about. And that's actually an interesting way to look at it, so that a lack of information implies that the information is common. It's why you don't need to explain it, as opposed to new things that might be more documented, because it wouldn't be well known. Huh. I mean, it makes sense when you put it out that way, but at the same time, as a way to examine cultural influence, a lack of information implying that there is more information is, frankly, absolutely frustrating, because it means the most important information would be the information you have the least documentation of and would be the hardest to find unless you get absolutely lucky. That's fascinating and frustrating entirely.
It would be like if somebody wrote a step-by-step instruction manual on how to operate a flush toilet, or made a 20-foot sculpted frieze describing the fitness gram pacer test. Why would you do that? So
I know there's probably a joke in there somewhere, but frankly, that sounds absolutely fascinating, and why not? That would be really funny.
As a result, we find terse references that imply a backstory we can't find, and maybe stories that weren't even written down because they were probably just known by everybody. Whereas Huitzilopochtli's single noteworthy story is perfectly documented, the feathered serpent is a mess of fragmented legends frequently referencing facts or events that probably used to be well known.
I wonder if that means there might just be some cultures that are still keeping those stories alive without realizing they're connected to the overarching ones, because they've drifted so much by this point that they are still the Quetzalcoatl myths, but without the name associated with it because it just changed. Oh god, that would be a cultural anthropologist's dream, to find that and actually correlate that information. Hell, I'm not even into that field, and I would find it fascinating.
very scattered myths describing his birth, but most of them sound kind of like, and this was the birth of Quetzalcoatl, with no further explanation about who he is or why it's a big deal, like it's some big pop culture reference or a sweet cameo everyone would get. There's a Yucatec Maya version where his birth story is basically that a snake is born to a human family, and his older sister explicitly recognizes the snake as the feathered serpent god. So he's clearly a pre-existing player.
I'm sure I don't know what you mean. Honestly, it's kind of cute just seeing it so small. It's like, ooh, you look familiar. Just cute art. Huh. So in other words, this would be rebirth as opposed to first birth because they already knew it.
And not even his origin stories properly explain where he comes from. And in contrast, Huitzilopochtli's origin story explicitly ends with a why you should care explanation, assigning him the ability to keep the world from getting eaten. Quetzalcoatl never gets that treatment, probably because he never had to, which means us modern people who lack the cultural ubiquity and the context that would have existed at the time have no idea what his general deal was. But anyway, moving on from that bout of
Before she moves on, I just want to point out the idea of how important cultural context is. It's really important. If you're just 20 years removed from something, and sometimes even less than, depending on where you're at, you can lose all the context to a story, which is absolutely massively important because when you're writing something down, there's two ways you write. Either something completely made up, kind of like the newer stories and the Huitzilopochtli. I'm probably butchering the name. You probably understand that by now. This one, admittedly, I'm probably butchering less than the other names I always say, so, me, names, I don't do them well. But those myths, you have to show everything, you have to explain everything. It's why the newer ones were more documented, like she said. But also, in the current sense, when you write fantasy verse, when you write something down to earth, fantasy you have to write everything about, so in the common sense, you don't have that common understanding. You have to build every step of it. Where if you write something in a more common sense, down to earth, today, with current interpretations, you can make references to things that would make sense now, to the audience now. And it's a great historical time capsule if someone finds it because it shows what people were thinking about, what was common. It's like when you start listing off J-Lo songs for a single year. Also, I have no idea if she still does music or not because I'm very culturally dead. That would be a thing. Or if for some reason you said reference Taylor Swift as the biggest artist out there, you would know that if you say anything else, the Swiftie fans would find you and they would make it painful, and they may or may not be in your family. You cannot get away from it. It is actually a problem. Send help. I mean, if specific family I reference find out about this, it definitely wasn't about you. I'm going to delete this for safety's sake. More importantly, that's actually really fascinating how that works out. So it's not even that hundreds of years of drift would happen. It's that any drift at all from that cultural relevance would remove the context. Add on thousands of years, and yeah, you can see where this would become a problem. That's actually disappointing because without any way to find that context, so much would be lost. And just loss of information bugs me, but also the chance to find it is just fascinating.
Rampant theorizing, given the fact that there were so many fascinating Lovecraftian gods in Teotihuacan, why was it that only the feathered serpent got so popular? Why not the flayed guy or that jaguar thing? Well, according to some theories, the feathered serpent had the advantage of some hefty symbolism to help him get so popular to begin with. First off, although dragons may make sense to us now, the concept of a flying snake is kind of an inherent contradiction if you think about it. Since he could fly, he was inherently divine, but his snakeness also made him earthly. A being that was both of heaven and of earth was potentially a useful bit of dualism. Maybe that's why the feathered serpent ended up with such a prolific cult, although the word cult kind of has wrong implications. But regardless, after or
because it would have had replacement of its own priest, and it continued beyond a single leader, so it wouldn't be a cult, as opposed to 40K, where while they have replacements of leaders, they have, or priests, they have one specific leader, and he never died, so it technically still could be considered a cult in a very weird sense. Yeah, that's usually the definition. It's, can you replace priests, and does it survive time? There's a lot more to it, but that's the very small one. If it's just a small group of people worshiping a charismatic figure, that's more of a cult. But some people just, the terminology is weird, and it's not always applied correctly, even internally to people who think they're a cult and aren't, and the people who aren't a cult who think they are. And then the people who don't think they're a cult and who are really a cult, which sounds similar to what I just said, but the emphasis really is important on that one.
Perhaps even before the fall of Teotihuacan, feathered serpent worship and iconography spread all over the place. Everywhere his influence landed, he was interpreted in a different way. The Nahua saw him as a god of the winds and of creativity, while the Quiche Maya had him as a...
More difference. See, all this is just fascinating to me right now. I have to press that button.
Influence landed, he was interpreted in a different way. The Nahua saw...
When learning the dawn, Venus, really? Merchant's arts. Nice.
Him as a god of the winds and of creativity, while the Quiche
Wind and rain, water, cloud, and sky, carries the sun, mediator god. Oh, 2 heads. Wait, what? Oh, that's a very unfortunate head.
Maya had him as a creator deity with an affiliation with wind and rain, who also carried the sun god Tohil through the sky. The Lacandan Maya, meanwhile, saw him as
Kukulkan, evil, monstrous, pet of the sun god, but the other Maya, still Kukulkan, combined with a historical ruler of Chichen Itza with the same name. Oh, causes earthquake, heralds rain, burned his tongue on the sun. Oh.
less of a fun god and more of a giant monster that also happened to be a pet of the sun god. There were recurring trends. Usually he had some.
So everyone has different views of it, but sun-related, rain-related, pet of the sun, burned tongue of the sun, carries the sun 2 heads, mediator, learning the arts, causes earthquakes, burned tongue, evil, Lacedonia, Quiche, Nawa, and Yucatan. But then there's the wind affiliated, the we don't know what these crossovers would be, but they seem to be big implications there. Huh.
Some affiliation with the wind or the weather, and was at least tangentially related to the sun, but there's no real consistency in his characterization. Despite that, the feathered serpent was ubiquitous. The subsistence farming Yucatec Maya even used the ubiquity of the feathered serpent cult to facilitate trade and communication with other tribes. Now, because the feathered serpent was such.
And that might be how they initially spread it. It was based on trade from the city, if that's how it initially spread, or was the city taking advantage of it and then spreading it further, because trade with people who recognize a similar totem would probably realize, oh, hey, we know something. We have something in common. I mean, that works in trade to build some kind of rapport. That's not going to be a new concept, so they probably could be aware of it. It's like, hey, person does better whenever they think we have something in common. Nice. If they actually do that, it even works better. I wonder if that's what initially started it, or would have predated that and they just took advantage of it. Again, this is the kind of stuff if I wasn't absolutely horrible at history, I would love to become a history major. You need memory to do that, and I has none.
Such a ubiquitous but subdivided figure, it's practically impossible to pin down anything resembling solid mythology about him. I mean, hell, the Aztecs reimagined him as mostly human, which has caused some people to theorize that their image of Quetzalcoatl was modified by anything from a very lost Viking to straight up Jesus. This is also why he can seem so
Jesus? What? Were the Aztecs around during that time period for that kind of change to happen prior to them being destroyed? Also, very lost Viking would be funny as hell and make for a great story.
Consistent in his overall characterization. He kind of doesn't have one. He had one to begin with, but this is what happens when cultures last for thousands of years. Stuff drifts. The feathered serpent is more than just Quetzalcoatl. He's an ancient deity.
Although I would just make one correction. You don't need thousands of years for drifting. You could do that really fast. Granted, it's kind of exacerbated right now because online is everything's shifting all the time constantly. But frankly, it happens pretty fast even without that influence. Just maybe a couple years. I do mean couple years. And I might be being generous to say it would take that slow of a time.
Anywhere from 2,200 to 3,000 years old that we can only get a proper glimpse of through the dozens of different interpretations that the tribes of Mesoamerica assigned to him over the millennia, which is super cool, but also kind of Lovecraftian. I mean, those Teotihuacan placeholder god names sound straight up at the Mountains of Madness. The Flayed God? Seriously?
And that was Quetzalcoatl. I'm fascinated by all the history she put in there, and I know Blue's the one who does more history, and that's why she actually apologized to say, no one tell Blue at the little after talk, but frankly, just I love this. I love when her and Blue really get into the history aspects and see how things happen. And just the fact that she went in, it's like, hey, here's how the things developed. This is what I'm really interested in. I love this. I like the mythology. I like the story of it. I like how things change. But going into that nitty gritty of here's how it changed. Here's how we know these things are accurate, but it's all over the place. So it must have been major because everyone had their own interpretation. So it spread from a cultural point. And if you can pinpoint how long the stories changed, if you had enough stories that were later deviated, you can maybe trace it back to where they were changing from to see where the connection points would come from and maybe ascribe it to a point of translations and changes in population. But at the same time, if the stories spread wide enough, you might not be able to because they could cross-pollinate and change themselves on top of that. And that's not even bringing in the idea that one charismatic storyteller who has a really good take could become massively influential and just spread their own interpretation because it's a good story. Or then there's also just the rulers like this story more. When you say it this way, that embellishes their reputation. So you do it that way. And I could go on about this for literally hours and I'd be perfectly happy about this. This is just so freaking cool. I think these myths are probably some of my favorite things Red has done. I like all the stuff she does. I like all the stuff Blue does. It's all fascinating, but just when you get into the gritty next to the mythology, this is just so cool. It's literally history crack as far as I'm concerned, and it's really fascinating. Basically, what I'm saying is if you haven't already, there's a link below to the original video. Hit it up. I'll see you guys in the next one. Adios.